What if something happens to Biden or Trump that disqualifies them? Like, I know this is morbid, but what if one of them dies? Let's start with President Biden and the Democrats. We asked our colleague Reed Epstein, who is covering Mr. Biden's re-election campaign, for insight into how the president and the Democratic Party are thinking about this question. There is no plan B. Joe Biden will be the Democratic nominee unless one of two things happens. Either he suffers a major health calamity between now and November, or Mr. Biden himself decides that he's not going to run. On the first point, we all hope that the president remains in good health. He seems to be. He rides his bike. He rides the Peloton. He is a very healthy 81-year-old man. There's also no reason to believe that he's going to wake up one day and decide this is not for him. The man has wanted to be president of the United States for most of his adult life. He first started seriously considering running for president in 1984. He ran for president 3 times. He has already raised more than $200 million in this campaign for re-election. There's no reason to think that he is going to change his mind. How would the Democratic Party pick a replacement? Scenario 1, before the Democratic Convention in August. In that case, the delegates to the convention would choose both the president and the vice president if there was a vacancy. It would be a free-for-all at the convention. And based on what we know about who those delegates typically are, it would be hard to imagine a scenario where the presidential nomination didn't go to Vice President Kamala Harris. The delegates are loyal to the Democratic Party. The biggest caucus is women. The second biggest caucus is African Americans. And those are 2 groups that are generally loyal to the vice president. It's unlikely that other Democrats would step up and challenge Harris under those circumstances. She could even be the president at that point, and then that would mean challenging a sitting president. That's a very steep political lift for anybody in that type of chaotic environment. Scenario 2, after the convention. If something happens to Mr. Biden or he changes his mind after he is officially nominated, there is no precedent for what happens next. But the document officially calling for the 2024 convention outlines the process. Jamie Harrison, the Democratic National Committee chair, would confer with the Democratic leadership in Congress and the leadership of the Democratic Governors Association, and that group would be authorized to fill vacancies on the national ticket with some input from the broader DNC membership, which is about 440 people. In both scenarios, before or after the convention, the decision is up to the leadership of the Democratic Party, which makes it a relatively elite process. On the Republican side, is there any chance it's not Trump? We called Maggie Haberman, the Times senior political correspondent, to talk through the hypotheticals that could impede the 77-year-old Mr. Trump's path to the nomination. The chances of Donald Trump waking up one day and deciding not to go forward are close to 0. The campaign is so intertwined with his fight for staying out of prison, given that he has been indicted 4 times and is now facing a certain trial starting at the end of March in Manhattan. So that comes off the table. In terms of whether there would be a health event, that's not an impossible thought. We know from the White House doctors, he had a form of heart disease during his presidency. It's unlikely that has changed dramatically in a positive direction. We don't know what his health is like now, but I do know that at the end of 2022, when they were looking ahead to a campaign that he was about to run, there was private discussion about not holding too many events in part because he's old. And they didn't want to cause him damage by running him into the ground. And I do think that that's part of why we have seen less of him. I think there are other reasons, too, but his age is a factor. Could anything keep Trump from being on the ballot? It would have to be a catastrophic event. If it was something mild, I think he would try to push forward, and I'm not sure we would even know it was happening. I think it would have to be something that could not be hidden, like an extended hospital stay, or something that happens on stage or in front of a crowd. It's not as if we have no predicate for that with Mr. Trump. He was really, really sick with COVID, and they were, to put it mildly, less than candid about what was going on with his health. So I have no reason to believe it would be different this time. As for whether the Republican Party has a plan B, let's be clear, there is no party absent Donald Trump. He is literally in the process of ousting his own hand-picked Republican Party chair to try to get another one who he thinks will focus more on his false claims of widespread election fraud. So there is no they. The process works this way. If something were to happen ahead of the convention, there would have to be a change in the rules. And it would have to be that the delegates' process changes, because Mr. Trump is the person leading in delegates right now. And Nikki Haley wouldn't necessarily get those by default just because she's the person still actively campaigning. I think you would see a lot of other candidates who have suspended their candidacies suddenly start campaigning again, and then it would get decided at the convention. If something were to happen after the convention, then the 168 members of the Republican National Committee would have to meet again and figure out what to do. And even then, it gets murky because depending on the timing, you could end up in a situation where a lot of states have already printed ballots with Donald Trump's name. So to summarize, I think it is extremely unlikely that he will not be the nominee. But it's not impossible. Anything can happen, as we've seen. What if Trump goes to prison and then is elected? Donald Trump has been indicted on 91 felony charges across 4 criminal cases in state and federal courts. On paper, he is facing some 700 years in prison, and yet he's also on track to win the GOP nomination. So what happens if he is convicted and sent to prison, but then wins the election? A lot will depend, obviously, on timing. The first of Mr. Trump's criminal trials, over hush money payments made to an adult film star in 2016, is scheduled to begin on March 25 in Manhattan. But regardless of the precise timeline, Mr. Trump's legal status is one of the biggest wildcards of the 2024 presidential election. Our colleague Alan Feuer, who is covering the criminal cases against the former president, joined us last fall to talk through some of the possibilities. Once the election interference federal trial gets underway, it likely will last between 2 and 3 months, something like that. And I would probably say at this point, barring the unforeseen, Mr. Trump will be convicted in that case. I have watched hundreds and hundreds of these January 6 related cases in the federal district court in Washington, and in over 500 cases, only 2 have resulted in acquittals. That amounts to 98.9% guilty verdicts, and, I think, playing the odds, Mr. Trump will end up in the same position. And so once there's a conviction, there's a sentence. Period. There's going to be a sentence. So, it is absolutely possible that Donald Trump will be sentenced to a significant amount of federal prison time before the 2024 election is held. Then, if Mr. Trump wins the election, even with a conviction on his shoulders, and even with a sentence hanging over his head for significant prison time, he could attempt to pardon himself, commute his sentence, and effectively have the case nullified. Now that, too, is untested ground. That may be another issue that the Supreme Court has to weigh in on. But what if Mr. Trump wins the election? The political power and the levers of control that will be at his disposal could, in theory, absolutely reverse the significant consequences that the election interference case imposed on him. Could a third-party candidate make a difference? The answer, according to Ested W. Herndon, the host of The Run-Up, is pretty clearly no. Third-party candidates, even with the name recognition of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., face significant challenges in terms of ballot access. The centrist group No Labels hasn't managed to attract prominent candidates to join its efforts. But what third-party candidates can do, even if they're not on a ballot, is complicate the calculus of how Donald Trump versus Joe Biden might play out, or affect the type of issues they have to address. Or they could become a vessel for people to lodge their distaste. We could end this year with the highest number of third-party votes this country has seen in a long time. And that will certainly matter. But it is overwhelmingly likely, because of the way that our political process works, that the next president is either the Democratic or Republican nominee. So, how does polling work? And can I trust it? To answer the biggest question of all when it comes to polling, can we trust what the numbers say? We turn to Nate Cohn, chief political analyst for The Times. Trust is an interesting word to use. At The Times, the standard for what it means to trust our journalism is super high. We present ourselves as providing something like an objective truth to readers, true facts. And the truth is, polling does not reach that standard. And it never has. Even when response rates were very high, polls are random samples. They're fuzzy statistics that are deeply imperfect and subject to all different kinds of error. What you can do is learn quite a bit from polling even though it's deeply imperfect. Take the recent elections. As bad as polls were in 2020 and 2016, the national polls were only off by 3.5 points in 2020 and 2 points in 2016. Now, in an era of close elections, 3.5 and 2 points is a lot. It's the difference between victory and defeat, or, in the case of 2020, between a landslide and a fairly close race. But it gets you in the ballpark for a lot of things. But what about very low response rates? It is fair to ask, how do we even know polling is in the ballpark? How do we reach voters in an era when people screen their calls? We have a mix of evidence that tells us that this stuff is still useful. Some of it's based on hard research. In 2022, The Times did this study of Wisconsin, where we mailed voters financial incentives to take a poll, and got 30% of people to take that survey, and ran a telephone phone poll in parallel that had a 1% response rate. And the answers were basically the same. So the differences between this group of people who take a telephone poll and the broader population may not be that great. And then on an individual poll-by-poll basis, we can scrutinize the poll based on the handful of facts that we do have. Does it have the right number of Democrats or Republicans by party registration? Does it have the right number of young people and old people? Does it have the right number of white voters or black voters, and so on? And those characteristics help give us confidence as well. None of it adds up to being perfect. None of it adds up to being objective fact. But it does add up to being useful.